Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, podcasting from the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center in Chicagoland, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel Yang, the director of the Sen Institute, and we're excited to have with us today Mike Cosper. Mike is the director of podcasting for Christianity Today, where he hosts The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and Cultivated, a podcast about faith and work. Mike served as one of the founding pastors of Sojourn Church in Louisville, Kentucky, from which he launched the collective Sojourn Music, and he's also the author of several books, including Faith Among the Faithless and Rhythms of Grace. But before we hear from Mike, let's go to our host, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and executive director of Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, Ed Stetzer.
Hey, it's good to have you on the podcast and good to have Mike on the podcast. It's interesting because I'm not quite sure, even in thinking about this podcast, how to start the conversation, because there's funny history that Mike and I have. I've had a little fun about his worship service at his church and a book I wrote years ago. I've known him. He's been in my living room. He was in my living room when he was 22 years of age. At the same time, it's a pretty sober. I mean, this whole thing's pretty. So I think if you didn't listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, I can't imagine anyone listening to our podcast that hasn't listened to it. But I mean, it's a sober conversation. So, and there's also things that like are fun. Like I want to say to him, who does a podcast episode that's 2 hours and 30 minutes long? And the answer would be Joe Rogan. But I get, but not everybody does. So I think I'm gonna start with just kind of walking through, and then people will know that we're not like best friends, but we've known each other for a couple of decades, and even through this conversation with Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, ended up reconnecting as well. So let's talk to us about it. First of all, I mean, I was struck by, I listened to all the episodes. Everyone I know listened to all the episodes. I've actually got a class coming up that deals with leadership and power, that it's required listening for a class, a master's degree class it's a demon class here at Wheaton College. But there's a heaviness throughout that everyone feels. Some people think that Mike Cosper didn't go to some of the deepest and darkest places. Other people say this is just, I saw failure porn is one term I've saw people use and more. So let's just start with some personal question for you. We walked through this. This was not like a 6-week project for you. How did you kind of walk through some of you talked about being melancholy into the last episode, but how did you walk through this and try to balance to tell the story and more? Give us the background.
Yeah. So, I've been connected with a number of the folks who were, part of the story for many years, from back when I was a pastor and in ministry. And I saw the devastation that it wreaked in their lives, when the church closed its doors. And I felt like, as much as anything else, what I found compelling about the story was that kind of heartache and aftermath, because I don't think that translates oftentimes into what typically makes the front page of, a newspaper or whatever about a pastoral failure or a pastoral resignation, is the aftermath, the devastation in its wake. I would say the other part of it that I don't think makes it in there a lot of times is the fact that it's a long, slow build, and that there are often signs that simmer for a very long time. So, yeah, I mean, it was an incredibly challenging experience, and in sort of living in that world with people for, days and weeks and hours. And, it's like 17 hours of a podcast with all the tape added up end to end. But it was hundreds of hours of sitting on Zoom calls and phone calls and interviews with people, literally reliving some of the worst moments of their lives. And God was gracious, and, by his grace, I was able to sit and participate in that with them and hear the heartache. And I wanted the audience to feel some of that along the way.
Yeah, but you also, and again, when a new episode would come out, just, you could see a lot of people found it very helpful. A lot of people, and obviously far more people found it helpful because of the listenership, but you could see the criticism, and the criticism grew each time, is that, you, even at the beginning, what happened, it's about us. Look at the good that came out of Mars Hill. And so it seemed almost, how do you hold these things where you're having a conversation about a lot of deep hurt and trauma and more, and yet you're you're also saying here's some good things, and who's at fault at Mars Hill? We all are. So did you have that kind of posture in the beginning? And are you glad you held that posture? Did that posture hold up? Help us to understand a little more about it, because that was one of the more widely criticized parts of it.
Yeah. I definitely had the posture in the beginning. I remember I had a conversation with someone who was she was on the show, and she told me when we had our first phone call, I really want to encourage you, try to only talk to people who love Mark.
Hmm.
Because that context, that relationship is really important. Otherwise, they're just, another critic, and the internet's full of those kinds of people. And ex Mars Hillers there's plenty of those kinds of people as well. Um, I, I think that's the complexity of the church in general, is that there's always this kind of, possibility for this kind of harm and this kind of wounding, because we're all, it's a cliche, but it's the truest cliche in the world. We're all sinners. We're all in need of God's mercy and grace. Um, and so the fact that God works in these kinds of broken spaces, if you're not willing to tell that part of the story, you're just lying. Like, you're just not being honest about what's actually at stake and what's actually happening. The problem to me is that never becomes a justification for the kinds of darkness that took place at Mars Hill. And I think too often that's used in a pretty glib way. So there's a little bit of an intentional arc inside the podcast to open the show and really to open the arc of those first 4 episodes in particular, to draw out some of that and that positive impact along the way. And we revisit it as well with the baptism stories and the things that were happening at Easter in 2011 and all of that. But I think the other side of that is this sort of cumulative effect of the harm and the wounding, which we draw out. And then obviously, of course, when you get to the aftermath, the finale, like that's a heavy episode, because you really see, wow, look what was left behind at the end of the story.
I mean, you've got some hindsight, now that the series is over, and I'm sure you might have some bonus episodes that you want to release. But given where the series is at now, the gap of like the expectations of what did you hope people would get from it, and then now like how people have actually processed the series. Can you talk about that? So going into it, like what did you want people to get from it, and then what's been the aftermath of the actual podcast, and especially how it's impacted you?
Yeah. I definitely went into it with some anxieties about like sort of the failure porn thing, right? Like another sort of scandal documentary. The world doesn't need, to be filled with those kinds of things. So I don't think, maybe in a story like this, it's just not avoidable that some of that happens. I think that has happened for sure. When I see people sort of, banging their spoon on their high chair saying, where's my new episode, that kind of thing, I feel like, the spirit of this is maybe not being received in the way I would love for it to have been received. But I think overwhelmingly, because it took off, and we never imagined it would have the kind of audience it's had, because it took off, I'm hopeful and optimistic that it's catalyzing a conversation about kind of power and weakness in leadership, repentance in leadership, spiritual abuse. I'm hoping it catalyzes a national conversation, maybe even a global conversation around those issues in a new and constructive way.
Let me talk personally just for a bit, because I remember at the early days at Sojourn, and I remember, you've heard me do the talk or where I wrote about it, where you and the worship team were up there, and you're writing your own songs, so you didn't want to be sold out to the man singing commercial music, and then it took off, and Sojourn Worship took off, and soon you had your own album and more. So you have actually gone from, in my just observation of you in 20 years, this kid trying to figure out what he believed, to becoming an artist with a well-reviewed album, people singing the songs in different places. Now you're at CT and all. So how, as you're telling the story of how you're talking about the medium, you're talking about all kinds of things of concern that kind of shaped Mars Hill in ways that became problematic. When you're looking at your own journey, how does that impact? What does that feel like for you?
I think to me, it's a continual question in my mind. Like, what do we do with what the story reveals? Um, I find myself continually convicted by some of the things Andy Crouch says about
Mm.
the gravity we have towards, mediated relationships because of technology. Um, and certainly, Mars Hill was a vanguard for that. And we wanted to tell that story because I think what's so fascinating about it is that, it's Jurassic Park, right? Like they were so focused on like whether or not they could do it that they never stopped to think like, should we do it? Um, for us, at Sojourn and with Sojourn Music and the rest of it, with kind of what we did and where we took things, there was a similar kind of sort of naivety and hubris of like, well, we have permission, or at least no one's stopping us. So let's experiment with music. Let's try different things. Um, there are definitely things I look back on creatively as a worship pastor, as somebody who's trying to cultivate a worshiping community inside the church that I look at now and go, I think there's definitely things I would do differently. Um, and I think, yeah, I mean, it's truly 21st century problems that anybody can have a platform, and that platform, because of the nature of sort of virality, can explode really, really fast.
Hmm.
So I would say, like, on one level, I don't think in and of itself media is evil and harmful and that it needs to be sort of shut down. I think the lesson of Mars Hill is that we've got to be very, very careful about who are we promoting on that medium. Are they prepared for it? And how like the degree to which we allow the numbers that are accumulated via the medium online, how much are we allowing that to kind of dictate our endorsement and our partnership and everything else?
Yeah, but I think you can't miss the irony or the tragedy that you telling this story. I mean, Mike Cosper is a household name in a lot of places now. And where I don't know. I mean, when I looked one time, it was the #4 podcast in the whole world, not the religious world, but the whole world. Did you feel some of the impact of that? In other words, we're saying, look at what this did and some of the destruction that it could wrought in a church. Yet, I mean, you're now, Mark Driscoll was one of the top podcasts in the world. You were one of the top podcasts in the world. What does that mean for Mike Cosper? Did you feel that impact you, pull you, draw you, shape you, push you, any of those things? Were you immune from those things?
I'm not immune to those things.
I wouldn't think.
Yeah. No, I had a good pastor that along the way is, just somebody I've known from a distance that, began sort of reaching out to me, encouraging me, praying for me along the way. And we had a conversation one time, and he just had this very frank word in the midst of this thing saying, "Hey, I hope you don't forget about the judgment of God." And
Subtle.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he says, remember your death, remember the judgment of God. And those are the things we have to keep before us, because that's truly the only thing that keeps a leader sober, is a recognition that, like, life is short, the judgment of God is real, and our purposes live in this narrow bandwidth of trying to live in accordance, and to pursue the flourishing of God's people and the goodness of humanity in general. So I think that that's definitely had an impact for me in just trying to not take seriously the numbers. I mean, it sounds like it sounds like the kind of thing like everybody wants to say, oh, I stopped looking at it, like I didn't pay attention to it. But along with that, I have a friend who's actually not a Christian, but is like a very, very successful guy in the entertainment business. And, some of his advice to me was very similar. And he basically said, just don't even look at the numbers. Like, don't let it get to you, because it's going to mess with your head in all kinds of ways. And to the best of my ability, I tried to sort of do that as well. And I think there's a parallel with pastors, right? Like how much do we allow numbers and success and all of that kind of stuff to shape who we are? It's the same kind of, it's the same kind of vocational hazard.
Did you find and again, I don't know the answer to these questions, so we're just having a conversation here. But by the time you're in episode 3 or 4, this is a very big thing. And people are yelling at you online and saying you should do more of this or more of that. I remember after you had a couple of authors on, people said, well, this proves he's going this direction, and other people going this direction. Did that impact you at all? Did you change what you wanted to cover based on some of the feedback? Would fill in spots that maybe you missed, or how did you respond to that?
Yeah, it really didn't change what we wanted to cover. That's the honest truth, because we knew where we were headed in terms of the story. Part of why certain voices were on there at certain times and places, a significant part of it is like, hey, those were the people in the room. Those were the people who lived this story, who were part of these conversations, who had the relationships to be there. And I think one of the things that stirred a lot of sort of anxiety and criticism and frustration with the podcast was some of the positive things we said about Rachel Held Evans' critiques of Mark.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that. I looked back through my old direct messages and texts with Rachel that talk about Mark Driscoll a lot. I can't imagine telling the story without talking about Rachel Held Evans' engagement and involvement. I mean, to me, that was a strange criticism from some quarters. But I guess people were like, well, is he going here? Is he going there? And there was like second guessing along the way. Did that second guessing nudge you or no?
No, because it really, we just kept going, this, as the story goes along, I think it's gonna prove itself to be honest. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I just want to tell the story honestly.
Yeah.
And that's why those people were on, because again, they were there, they lived it.
Well, this brings up this is a fascinating discussion, because you're a content creator, and pastors and leaders in some ways are content creators. So it brings up the question of, like, how do you utilize the medium, and then how do you balance that with, like, creating the right content and like self-editing? I don't know if that's maybe the right way to talk about it, but like, in your process of creating content, Mike, like, how did you edit yourself, especially since you had some personal connections with some of the players in the episode? Because I think there's a lot of that pastors are dealing with. Like this week, there's a pastor who had a really weird sermon illustration that landed him on a couple of discernment blogs and stuff like that. So
on the front page of the Drudge Report, but yeah, right. I guess that's on a discernment blog. But yeah.
So how do you help? Like, how did you work through those things so that it didn't include so much of yourself, but at the same time you did do some self-disclosure throughout the podcast?
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, part of that's just I'm just very thankful for CT, because I have people who around me who have some really good wisdom about that. Our editors, Andrea Palpant-Dilly, was part of our team, and that was one of the ways she was weighing in, was to kind of help me think through, where is it necessary to disclose versus where is it helpful to do enough disclosure that sort of sets up the reality that, like, what you're about to hear is editorializing. This is me speaking from my experience and my own personal reflections. But at the end of the day, the question I kept asking myself, or the challenge I kept giving myself to editorialize or to shape the content along the way, was to keep coming back to, like, this is the story of the people at Mars Hill. So I want to be honest about, Tim Smith and Nate Burke and, Jesse Bryan's experiences. Is this, Jen Smith's experience, Wendy Alsop's experience? Is this being honest to those things? Is this putting them forward in the clearest manner? And after you do that for so long, quickly, even in a 2.5 hour episode, as you've pointed out, there's not a lot of room left for yourself and for your own story. So
yeah, there was not a lot of. You could have been more, as you could have told your own journey, and I would have. Maybe not everyone would have engaged it, but all right. So let's talk some about the aftermath of the aftermath. The Mark DeMaz, friend of mine, I'm guessing mutual friend, he tweeted on December 14th, 2021. Note to churches and lay leadership: you're no Mars Hill, and your pastor is not Mark Driscoll. May I humbly suggest no need to overthink your situation and/or create problems that don't exist. I sense too much of this unnecessarily happening. if and where so, not helpful. Yet there are real stories. I mean, there's a lot of little Mars Hills all over, or maybe not so little. So, some concern, and I've heard it from many people, is that it's now caused people to be looking for things, some would say, that are not there. Others saying, no, it's helping you see more clearly what is there. The aftermath of for those who don't know, the aftermath was the last episode. So the aftermath of the aftermath, what has that created in people that you've seen?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, I think to some extent, it's definitely created something. To another extent, I think it's been a permission giving device for a lot of people who've had concerns and questions in advance. I mean, the online community of Christians who've had church hurt experiences was massive before the podcast started.
It was, yeah.
I mean, that's been a social media phenomenon for many years, and a blog phenomenon and all that. And I think, I mean, I definitely think there's a degree to which, what Mark is saying is absolutely true. I mean, we included, there's a clip on a bonus episode where we're talking to Matthew Lee Anderson, and Matthew is talking about kind of the negative experiences of a lot of ex-evangelicals, self-identified kind of deconstructed believers. And, he says, I think it's important to note that this is a marginal experience. And I think that's true. Like, that doesn't diminish the pain of it. But the idea that the vast majority of evangelicals haven't experienced that phenomenon, I think, is largely true. The question that I raise, and I think the question the podcast raises, is that I hope it raises, is an examination of what's going on behind the curtain. Because I think the clearest thing about the Mars Hill story is that the closer you got to the sort of inner circle of the inner circle of the inner circle, the more painful your fallout was in the aftermath. I think, unfortunately, there are dynamics there that, to much lesser degrees, are mirrored in a lot of different places. And, it should ask us some questions about, I mean, look, people have been asking this since the mid 90s, right? I mean, Marva Dawn in 1995 was talking about sort of the crisis of the corporate boardroom taking over the church parish. That's a question, that's a reform issue that I think we need to continually be addressing.
Let me press into that a little bit more, Mike, because I think this will bring us into some of the things that we want to talk about, like the theology, Reformed theology, complementarianism, those kinds of things. But, I mean, the last 5-6 years has been somewhat painful for American evangelicalism. We're here in Chicagoland. I mean, this was a case study. You could have picked a couple of other churches or ministries to do a case study on. So, what are some of the things about Mars Hill that you thought would make a really good case study? And then, are you introducing like a new genre of kind of like, Christian church autopsies? I mean, I've heard a lot of folks, say, when's the next, Willow Creek episode going to come out? So can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, I mean, to the latter question, I'm sure it will. I hope, I hope it doesn't become like the norm. I hope this isn't like the next sort of true crime genre that kind of takes over everything. Because I think the church needs to address some of these questions and issues, but I hope it's not all we're talking about. I think, for me, the hope for the church is that we can catalyze a conversation here that moves us towards something that's better and more beautiful. Like, there is a better and more beautiful church than the kinds of sort of leadership dominated dysfunctional communities that Mars Hill is representative of. We featured them prominently in part because so much of it was available online. And I think what made Mark unique was that there were moments, like that sort of infamous Nehemiah sermon where he talks about beating up the elders in his church, and certain sort of ways in which he's maybe an outlier amongst even complementarians, around the ways he talks about sexuality and stuff like that are, that are loud and clear in ways that other churches do things more quietly, but nonetheless kind of problematically. So it was that status as like the internet church where everything was online, everything was available, and I mean, frankly, like I did have some personal connections that got us in the door to feature that. So yeah, I mean, I've said it 100 times. Like Mark said things loudly that unfortunately I think have been mirrored in more quiet ways in a lot of churches.
It is. I do wonder too. Since the podcast came out, started. I think the Mulder and Marti's book on Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral came out. We actually had an interview with Marti here on the podcast. I do. So is there a rise and fall of Ravi Zacharias coming? Are these more stories that you and Christianity Today want to tell, or is this kind of a one-time conversation for you and CT?
For now, I'm not planning on doing another rise and fall podcast anytime soon. My plans to move on to different kinds of stories. We're still kind of exploring exactly what comes next for us, but for sure, that's not, there's not a season 2 featuring another pastor or elder. I don't say never because you don't want to say never.
Yeah, sure.
Again, my desire is not to be like the rise and fall of X celebrity pastor guy, for sure.
I just think there is. I mean, I am not among those who. I mean, I would I would have said this or would have done that. That's all. There's always people do that. It's a long form storytelling. Everyone will have opinions, but I do think the conversation about power. I like that you engaged Diane Langberg. I like I mentioned that your podcast is required reading in one of our listening in one of our doctoral seminars. In addition to that same seminar is her book, Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church. I do think this is an issue that that requires more conversation. It's not the Mars Hill podcast and then we're done. So what would you like to see so that we might have more healthy engagement of power? You mentioned Andy Crouch. First person we had on the podcast, actually, when we launched the Stetzer Leadership podcast back in the day was Andy. Very influenced by his writings on power. So what would you like to see happen from these conversations on the unhealthy use of power to be the church to be healthy? Because obviously it's not the elimination of the use of power. Well, you tell me, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, especially when you think in terms of the way sort of Andy defines power, which I would do a poor job of restating at the moment. But yeah, I mean, leadership is the exercise of power. I mean, Jesus' ministry is the exercise of a certain kind of power in certain kinds of ways. I had a conversation with a friend of mine several months ago, and kind of in the midst of the production of the series. And this guy pastors a very, very large church. And he said, he was wrestling through questions in the series and, trying to think through their own sort of internal dynamics at his church. And he's like, I'm just trying to think through, our measurables are growth, our measurables are baptisms. It's these sort of numbers metrics. What would you suggest, to change it? And I said, look, honestly, I don't know because it's the paradigm I've lived in as well. I think we need some good thinking about it. And I did say, like, what if for a season, our churches primarily measured hospital visits and funerals, showing up for people in the crisis moments of their lives, where we're sending our pastors and our community group leaders and whatever else to those moments when people are really in suffering. And that's a not just a side metric, to go alongside with whatever else we're taking pride in, but the degree to which pastoral care really is driven to the hurting places, the broken places, the grief-filled places in people's lives. Mm-hmm. That's what makes a huge difference. And that's what makes people love their communities and want to give their lives away to them. I'd love to see a church that's more focused on that. I'd love to see an understanding of leadership. And this is the Church Leaders podcast, right? Like, I do think there's something problematic about the way a certain style of leadership has almost been fetishized since the 90s, that sort of corporate CEO model. And again, even making that criticism is a cliche. You've heard it 1,000 times, mm-hmm. But I'm not sure I've seen somebody pose the alternative that says, okay, here's a character-driven model in the image of Jesus that can nonetheless lead a healthy, large community. And I'm not, I think it's totally possible. I mean, I think we live in an age of just big stuff. Everything's big these
Yeah.
days. We concentrate populations. So I'm not afraid of big churches. Um, I, I just want to come back to like, okay, what are we measuring? Like what matters to us, you know?
Well, I think that was a big theme throughout the podcast because there were so many people that were in Mars Hill that were willing to overlook the toxic nature of leadership because good things were happening. I mean, that was something that you just brought up repeatedly throughout the series. And I know when people are going through it, it's kind of hard to see and identify everything, and it's because it's happening, so you can't really see it with some distance. But you've had a chance to interview those who were involved, and like in retrospect, like what are some of the things that you heard from those who participated and said, you know what, we should have better accountability systems, better checkpoints. Like what are some of the things that you gleaned that church leaders can really learn from?
Yeah. One of the things that was interesting that I heard a number of times was the need for um, the need for pastors, like particularly like pastors who were coming in from the outside, to figure out like how do I vet the leader that I'm going to theoretically submit to, for the years to come. Because I think one of the red flags for Mark was, here's a guy who's never really been a church leader before, bragged openly about like, I've never been a member of the church. I was a new Christian and all this kind of stuff. Where were the patterns of submission to authority? Where were the patterns of accountability? How do I know that this is true, that this is real, that this is an environment that is safe and accountable if I'm gonna step into it? So I thought that was an interesting question, like to think about, whether you're a pastor who's joining a new community, or if you're going to come under the leadership of other pastors in your staff, or if you're a church member, when you walk in the door, like what do those things look like? And then, I've said this, I've said this in a couple of other places, but I think it's worth repeating. Like, if you're a church leader, I think one of the most important things that you can do is to go to the people who work, under your authority, and ask them, tell me honestly, how do you experience me negatively? And then believe them, believe what they say. Because I think what happens far more often is that you create these structures of accountability, and let's do a leadership 360 assessment and all of this kind of stuff, and our knee-jerk reaction is to kind of come back to it and go, well, here's the reasons I did that, and here's the reasons I do that, and that leader can't keep up with this, so that's why I don't respect. So the excuse making is tremendous. I think a posture of humility says, okay, I'm going to believe this person, and I'm going to find my pathways for repentance and to move towards health in these relationships.
One of the criticisms, and I started to keep coming to criticisms, but I think it's an opportunity to talk through some of those things. You shaped a conversation, and one of the criticisms is that you were dealing with abuse and misogyny, and I could list several other things, but you didn't really address that the root cause of these things were, from your critics, were Reformed theology and complementarianism. It seemed like you sort of wanted to say, in the last episode in particular, you talked about, you really pushed and said this is not the normal understanding of Reformed theology, and on more than one occasion, not the normal understanding of complementarianism. But people would say that you did not have a realistic view that those theological systems themselves are the things that create the opportunity, or themselves are abusive. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. It's a totally fair question. I would say, I think I know of too many examples of churches that are complementarian, where there are healthy communities, where there are women who are leading in ways that I think, would self-describe as like they're flourishing, and they're experiencing, good, healthy community and good, healthy leadership. I would also say, I think one of the obvious sort of counterfactuals is the fact that there's lots of abusive leadership taking place in egalitarian churches all over the place, namely Willow Creek. Bill Hybels was a champion for egalitarian leadership, throughout his ministry, and was a sexual predator. So I think to sort of narrowly define it to, a position on the roles of women in leadership in the church, I think has a, misses the point of, again, sort of the way power and power differentials work. You don't need Reformed theology and you don't need complementarian theology to have that kind of stuff in place. And then on the Reformed side, I always laugh at that critique because I'm like, y'all, I'm Reformed. Like I've written 2 books on Reformed theology. Like I'm very pro Reformed theology. So it's definitely, that's definitely not an issue to me. Again, I think it's the reality of this sort of power and weakness stuff, and the imbalances and the abuses is that it's a chameleon. It can take place inside any structure, any leadership structure. And it certainly doesn't need the church either. I mean, let's talk about Harvey Weinstein, whose ideology swings as far in the opposite direction of, Reformed evangelicalism as you can get. So, yeah. And it was one of those things. I mean, again, we didn't address it in the show in a defensive way because it was another example of one of those things that, like, we didn't want to be sort of pivoting to the audience's objections and the way we told the story.
I think one of the things that, as people were listening to the series and they were asking the question, like, what do we do with this? I think one of the things that I would consistently hear was we needed more empathetic leadership, like empathy. Leaders that could experience, how church members are experiencing, like what you said, the willingness to hear back from those that you're leading. As we're getting into kind of more of the practical side of how to apply, the rise and fall of Mars Hill, what do you think, like, if a church leader is experiencing this in their congregation, they realize that I've become self-aware of my own leadership style. Like, what do you think of some of the practical aspects of actually, softening their leadership style so that they can be humbled and listen to their, church members and those that are experiencing their leadership in negative ways?
Yeah. It's such a good question. And I don't think there's any shortcuts, right? I mean, it's a spiritual formation question. So it's like anything in our lives that, it's going to take sort of long obedience and practical steps of repentance. Where are the opportunities then, when it comes to this kind of stuff, like where are the opportunities to attend to the way power and works out in our relationships. And when we recognize abuses and destructive patterns, like when are we ready to sort of step up and say, okay, like I need to own X to this person. I remember Dallas Willard, told a story one time. He said, there's one of the things he realized was that the longer he was in the academic world is that it was a world full of white lies. It was just constant white lies. The number one of which being, I've read that book, and he said, so he made this decision for himself, that, to truly repent of that, like he needed to go back every time he told a white lie about having read a paper or whatever it was, or read in a bulletin or whatever it was, that he was going to go back to each person and he was going to say plain and simple, I lied to you about X and I'm really sorry. Will you please forgive me? And, his point as he was kind of sharing the story was like, we need to just sort of nakedly address, our sin when we recognize it and recognize that it's interpersonal and go to the person and ask for forgiveness. And that forces you into a position of humility really fast. And, I wonder if there aren't disciplines like that. I mean, I don't think it gets sort of easier or more systemic or more, I don't think it's something you can program. If we're recognizing in ourselves a gravity towards a certain kind of power, a certain kind of abusiveness, it is the simple work of repentance in relationship, and making a habit of it, making a habit of examining our hearts and going, where have I gone astray and where do I need to go and be reconciled to somebody? And I think for leaders who've been at this for a long time, if you've recognized that this is a serious process, that's going to be really, really hard and really painful. But I think it's going to bear fruit in incredible ways if you're willing to kind of step into that.
We've gone long for us. I recognize this is, a short podcast for you. And there's so many things I wish I could have asked and probably should have asked better. But let me do 2 quick closing questions and then we'll wrap. So one of them is, if you had to do the whole series again, what would you do differently?
Honestly, I don't think I've had enough space away from it yet.
Fair
to
enough.
answer that
Fair enough.
question. I really
Yeah.
don't.
And you mentioned in the final episode that there were bonus episodes.
Yep.
What bonus episodes should we expect?
Yeah, so we're doing an episode. One of the big issues to me is that the Mars Hill story represents a broader phenomenon of kind of a time where we have failed institutions that are no longer being formative and forming leaders in characterological ways. So we're doing a whole episode on institutions, and then we're doing an episode about the spiritual development of leaders. What does it take to build a leader that lasts? And then we're also going to be announcing soon some kind of roundtable discussions that are probably going to start initially be recorded as Zoom webinars that'll be live events. And for those that can't attend them, we'll release them in the feed later on.
You've been listening to Mike Cosper, the host and creator of the podcast series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. If you hadn't had a chance to listen to that, you can go over to Christianity Today and check that out. Also, you can learn more about Mike's ministry at mikedcosper.com. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content for ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com. And we found our conversation today helpful. We'd love for you to take a few moments to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.